What is inflation? If a time traveler from the distant past decided to visit the United States in the year 2022, they might be surprised to hear one word used over and over again: inflation.
The highest inflation.
The curve of inflation.
Inflation.
The pace of inflation.
Inflation. The highest inflation, in fact.
Inflation is a complex money term that's often more interesting to economists than everyday people. But in 2022, inflation has disrupted our lives in huge ways, which has made it a popular conversation topic on the news and in daily conversation. To explain it simply, inflation is the rate at which money loses value over time, which forces prices to increase. For example, say it usually costs $1 for you to buy a chocolate bar at the candy store. When inflation occurs, suddenly that dollar isn't worth as much. In other words, that dollar has lost some of its purchasing power. Now you have to pay $1.50 to buy the same chocolate bar. So how does inflation happen in the first place? There's one root cause of inflation, which is an increase in the supply of money in the economy. But there are several different ways in which more money is actually put into the economy. Economists have come up with 3 different theories for how inflation actually occurs. The first theory is known as demand pull inflation. This is when demand for goods and services exceeds production capacity. What does this mean exactly? Returning to the chocolate bar example. Let's say that a lot of people really want to buy a chocolate bar. Because the economy is good, they suddenly have more money to spend. However, the factory that makes this specific chocolate bar doesn't have a lot of workers and can only make 10 chocolate bars a day. The high demand and the low supply would obviously give the factory an incentive to increase the price for their chocolate bars, leading to inflation. The second theory of inflation is known as cost-push inflation, which is when production costs lead to increased prices. We can again illustrate this type of inflation with the example of a chocolate bar. Under cost-push inflation, perhaps the cost of cocoa and sugar has increased recently. As a result, since the materials they're using to make chocolate bars are so expensive, the manufacturers of chocolate bars have a reason to increase the cost of a chocolate bar overall. The last theory of inflation is known as built-in inflation. Built-in inflation occurs when prices are already rising and then people increase wages in order to help their employees maintain living costs. Sometimes this can lead to what's known as a wage price spiral, in which prices increase, so companies increase wages, which can lead to prices increasing more, and on and on and on. It's hard to predict the right amount to raise wages so that employees can have a good standard of living, but also so that wage price spiral doesn't happen, which is why there is often a lot of debate over issues like minimum wage. Now that we know some of the basics of inflation, let's look into the history of inflation and see if it offers any clues for what's causing the inflation crisis of 2022. A history of inflation in the United States. Inflation has been a feature of human society ever since we started using money. Evidence of inflation can be seen all the way back in the records of the ancient Romans and the ancient Chinese. The United States, of course, has experienced its fair share of inflation too. In recent U.S. history, there have been approximately 6 instances of high inflation rates since World War II. These instances are also known by economists as inflationary episodes. The first of these 6 episodes actually occurred right after World War II, starting around 1946. This inflationary episode occurred because there was a lot of demand for goods as the war ended and soldiers came back home. And also because there were still supply shortages as countries around the world recovered from pouring so many resources into the war. The combination of high demand and low supply led to a sharp increase in prices. In fact, it turns out that inflationary episodes often occur after disasters and wars for similar reasons. The United States, for example, also experienced inflationary episodes after the Civil War and World War I. The second recent inflationary episode in U.S. history occurred around 1951. This happened at the same time as the United States entered the Korean War. Inflation occurred because demand increased. Households rushed to purchase goods, remembering the supply shortages that occurred just a few years earlier during World War II. The third inflationary episode occurred between 1969 and 1971. This episode was caused by a growing economy, which increased prices. The inflationary episode didn't stop until President Nixon put a freeze on the rise of wages and prices. The fourth inflationary episode in recent United States history occurred between 1973 and 1982, and is considered to be one of the longest periods of inflation the U.S. has ever experienced. This inflationary episode occurred as a result of 2 huge increases in oil prices. The first increase in oil prices happened after OPEC, a powerful group that coordinates oil production in the Middle East, decided to stop sending oil to certain countries because of international disagreements. The second increase in oil prices during this period was caused by a decline in oil production as a result of the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. Because the U.S. had become heavily dependent on oil from the Middle East, both of these situations greatly disrupted the United States economy. This long-running inflationary episode only ended after the United States government established new money practices that brought inflation under control. Taken together, the third and fourth inflationary episodes of recent United States history are sometimes known as the Great Inflation, because this inflationary period hugely disrupted the U.S. economy and also forced economists to come up with new ways to deal with inflation. Subsequently, the fifth inflationary episode occurred from 1989 to 1991, when the country of Iraq invaded the country of Kuwait, leading to the First Gulf War. During this period, there was a lot of uncertainty about how other countries would access Middle Eastern oil, leading to inflation. And finally, the sixth and most recent historical inflationary period occurred during 2008. This was again the result of high oil prices, as gas skyrocketed to double its price in the span of a year. Many economists would probably add the inflation crisis of 2022 to this list of U.S. inflationary episodes since World War II. And in fact, there are a lot of similarities between the causes of past inflationary episodes and the episode of 2022. In the next segment, we'll learn more about how the inflationary episode of 2022 is affecting everyday people and what's causing prices to rise so quickly in 2022. The inflation crisis of 2022. In March of 2022, almost exactly 2 years after the COVID-19 pandemic first took over the world, inflation has now become one of the hot topics driving the news. All over the United States, inflation is affecting our daily lives. Food prices at restaurants and grocery stores are getting marked up. Gas prices have skyrocketed, often rising $1 or more a gallon and sometimes reaching over $7 a gallon in places like California. And in the housing market, certain cities that weren't particularly expensive before are becoming more populated, leading to higher housing prices and long-term residents getting kicked out because they can't afford the rent. Between March 2021 and March 2022, inflation increased by 7.9%, a higher rate than the country has seen since 1982. And if you remember from our last segment, 1982 marked the end of the Great Inflation, which happened 40 years ago now. Many economists predict that this current inflationary episode will continue unless monetary authorities take drastic measures soon. So what's causing this period of incredibly high inflation almost 40 years after the country's last major episode of inflation? It turns out that the inflation crisis of 2022 is the result of a combination of several unlucky factors, all striking the U.S. economy at the same time. These include high consumer demand, backed up supply chains, remote work, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's dive deeper into each of these factors to better understand how they're contributing to inflation in 2022. First up, high consumer demand and backed up supply chains. When the COVID-19 pandemic first hit in 2020, many economists assumed that consumer demand would go down. People were forced to stay inside their homes, which meant they couldn't spend money at stores or restaurants, and many workers were laid off, which reduced their spending money too. However, customer demand actually increased. Individuals started buying mass quantities of masks and other personal protective equipment. They also began purchasing products to make their homes more suitable for quarantine and work from home environments, including things like office furniture, electronics, and kitchen appliances. And with the wide availability of online shopping, it was easier than ever to buy things right from home. Due to the increased demand for different kinds of goods, the global supply chain was strained. Supply chains are systems that bring products created all over the world to your front door and are calibrated perfectly to get you exactly the things you need whenever you need them. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, supply chains struggled to adjust to the swift changes in customer demand, as well as to the dropping number of workers in the workforce. As employees got sick from COVID, it was difficult to keep up the high rate of production that had previously been a point of pride for global supply chains. And as customers demanded more and more items, supply chains got tangled, leading to situations like hundreds of ships lined off of California ports. Ultimately, the combination of high demand and low supply led to higher prices for routine items like household goods and groceries. This falls in line with the demand pull theory of inflation that we mentioned earlier, which states that when demand increases, but production can't make enough supply to meet demand, then prices increase. The second factor behind our current inflationary period has to do with the increasing popularity of remote work. Because of COVID-19, many employees were forced to start working from home to avoid spreading the disease. Although there were initially complaints about this new working model, a large number of people have since started to prefer working from home. One of the greatest benefits of working from home is the ability to work from anywhere in the world. As a result, many people have started to move to locations that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to live in before, attracted by new views and experiences. As people with remote jobs started flooding into places that were previously not as populated, the construction of housing has struggled to keep up. With the limited amount of housing and high demand, prices for individual houses and apartments have skyrocketed. Finally, the last factor behind the inflation crisis of 2022 that we'll talk about today is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In recent years, Russia has been the world's largest oil exporter. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, economists were uncertain about the future of oil exports from Russia. Would Russia still be able to deliver oil to the United States as they were waging war? At this point, gas and fossil fuel prices had already started to rise as individuals became fearful of a possible Russian oil shortage. And then, in March of 2022, the Biden administration announced that they would completely ban oil and natural gas coming from Russia. This was a way of showing support for the Ukrainian people and punishing Russia for waging war against Ukraine. While a good number of politicians and everyday Americans support the Russian oil ban, this has caused gas prices to increase at an even higher rate than before, leading to the astronomical gas prices we mentioned in places like California. So, due to a number of different causes, such as COVID-19, high customer demand, backed up supply chains, the popularity of remote work, and the Russian-Ukrainian war, everyday necessities like food, housing, and gas have become more and more expensive for the average American. What steps are being taken to limit the harmful effects of this inflationary period? Let's see what solutions people are coming up with in the next segment. Where do we go from here? Many ideas have been proposed by the government to slow down this current episode of inflation. Some of these ideas are commonly brought up in any period of high inflation. One solution is for the government to use wage and price controls. This is when the government passes laws to legally cap wages and prices at certain limits. Wage and price controls, however, are usually not advisable. They can cause job losses and a recession, which is a slowdown in the economy. The second common solution is for the government to fight inflation by reducing the money supply within an economy. This was the practice used to finally stop the previous Great Inflation, which ended in 1982. However, there are also other ideas being proposed that will tackle the specific causes of this particular instance of inflation. For example, in response to rising gas prices, because of the ban on Russian oil, the U.S. government had decided to release oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is made up of giant oil reserves located underground in Texas and Louisiana, and was actually created in the 1970s in response to the Great Inflation. Another specific issue that people are trying to solve is the high rate of inflation in the housing market. Experts have proposed that the solution is to build more housing and also build more affordable housing. However, housing markets are still struggling to keep prices from rising too high because there are simply not enough workers and materials to build housing fast enough. One final issue that the country needs to focus on in order to reduce inflation is to figure out how to get the supply chain up and running again. Since the supply chain is a complex network in and of itself, fixing the supply chain will require more than just one big change. One interesting potential fix for the supply chain is to make supply chains more local. This way, countries don't have to rely on factories all the way across the globe to get the things they need. As you can see, inflation is a huge problem, and people around the country are coming up with many different ideas to try to solve it. It's hard to tell how long this period of high inflation will last, and what will eventually help reduce inflation to manageable levels. But now you know the basics of inflation and can help explain it to others who may want to learn more about why prices are rising so rapidly in 2022. Thinking question. What are the differences and similarities between the causes of inflation in 2022 and the causes of past episodes of high inflation in the United States?